what is energy? Most people don't even think about it. If you go to a physics lesson, energy is work. Mm-hmm. Well, what's work? Well, it's the ability to get stuff done. Okay, right. But how does it affect us? Well, it's everything. Why did we get into energy? Why do we love it? Because it is everything.
It made things happen. It took the human race away from one man, one job to one man, 100 jobs. So you literally got the situation where machines and the ability to do more physically changed the human race in that all of a sudden agriculture could produce better than subsistence farming. Industry could produce better than individual person work. And even then there was resistance. The hand weaving industry was suddenly being replaced by machines that could do 100 men's work, days work in an hour.
So we can see it over the hundreds of years, but why don't we think about it? Right? No one thinks about energy. There was that survey 10 years ago where people think about energy for 7 seconds a year. It kind of changed after the Ukraine war, but no one thinks about how
because we take it for granted. You've got a situation where literally the average domestic motor vehicle has energy under the right foot of the operator equivalent to about 100 horses. Can you imagine a Victorian farmer with 100 horses? The infrastructure required to support 100 horses, the manpower, the saddler, the farrier, the grower of food supporting 100 horses. You go out into your driveway, you go click like that, boom, and all of a sudden you can move a ton or 2 tons plus all the occupants and whatever you want to be down the road without even thinking about it. Click, switch it off again. It's just there, available. And that's, the thing that hydrocarbons did is released us from daily toil. Less than 150 years ago, you would have people who had never left their small town to go to a big town because it was 10 miles away.
Yeah.
And it didn't have a railway line.
Well, to be fair, the biggest thing,
railway line.
It was the bicycle.
Yeah.
The thing that changed the genetic pool more than anything else was the bicycle. Because the bicycle, you could get 10 miles. But I guess the bicycle was invented, 1850s? But it required the Industrial Revolution to create it. So even though it was...
Because then you had to
possible.
make the bicycles. That was the issue. And without the Industrial Revolution, everybody couldn't have a bicycle. I don't know if you've ever bothered to stop in the big ugly part at the beginning of the Science Museum. My kids always used to want to rush past it. But those engines there, Trevithick, Watt, all of those people hand-built boilers and engines. So every bolt and every screw was made by a blacksmith and cut by hand. So the creation of that transformation from the hand-working economy to the machine-working economy meant that everyone could have one.
The science built on the science, right? So,
yes.
So as soon as you had the first one, you then had greater energy and you didn't need the blacksmiths and you could move into industry, like creating the bicycle and creating the ability to move forward.
I mean, you had this succession of things. An industrial revolution was reliant upon the agricultural revolution, which released people from the land.
Yeah.
And the agricultural revolution meant that a farmer could grow more food than he actually needed by a great deal, rather than just having his family's food and a little bit for market. So that released people who could then come together and take which were cottage industries into factories, which was basically places where people came together to do things. That was the original concept behind it. Admittedly water-powered to start with, but that meant that machinery could then be employed because it was commercially viable to do so. And obviously that changed society in a great way. And then when the steam engine came along, which was originally just trying to solve a pumping problem.
For coal mines.
Well, tin mines, I think, initially.
Yeah, and then they used it in coal mines to pump the water out, so
Yes.
you get more coal. You could use more coal to go into the steam engine. You could go deeper and everything built on everything.
I was actually involved in the oil industry in the 70s, and it was very dramatic in that the market was so volatile. We would literally load crude oil in the Persian Gulf, and then be instructed to proceed to Europe at the slowest navigable speed, just waiting for the price to go up. So you could load $10 million worth of oil at Ras Tanura in Saudi Arabia and head for Rotterdam, and you'd have $50 million worth of oil by the time you got there. Until the 70s, America had control of the tap. They were the swing supplier in the world. America opened and closed the tap, controlled the oil price. That flipped with the creation of associations of non-American oil countries who suddenly found out they had power. And the Western world had taken this all for granted for so long. And somebody said, well, actually, we're going to turn the tap down now. Bear in mind that although we think of America as a normal, rapacious head of global capitalism, they actually split up Standard Oil in an antitrust move between the two world wars to stop Standard Oil. I mean, I think it's 6 out of the 7 largest oil companies in the world at the time came from Standard Oil. They were part of Standard Oil.
What's Standard Oil?
Standard Oil was the Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller created one company. The problem with the oil industry is it's always been incredibly volatile, boom and bust all the time, because if you discover a new well, in the early days, you discover one new well, price could go down by 90% in a second. And it created huge fortunes, but companies went bust. And what he did was consolidate the entire industry to control supply, to keep the industry stable, as he would argue. Everybody else argued that it was monopolistic and it kept prices high. There's definitely 2 cases.
And when was that happening?
That was the early years, about 100 years ago.
1920s, 1920s.
Even earlier. It started in the 1900s.
It started he realised the position around the time of the First World War, because all of a sudden the world's demand for oil shot through the roof, because all the new navies, all the new ships that were being built ran on oil rather than coal.
Yeah.
Which made them a lot more mobile in terms of where they could go in the world. And he realised 2 things. One, he had to do something about controlling the market, because otherwise his investment could lose its value overnight. But he was the first person to genuinely vertically integrate an industry. So owning the wells, owning the transport, distribution, conversion into other products. And we're talking here about not so much fuel for cars, for automobiles, but kerosene and fuel oil.
Kerosene was the big one. I mean, for 30 years, that was the only real use of oil, or the major use was lighting.
For lamps.
Prior to electrical light, it was all kerosene.
They were running out of whales to kill, weren't they? So
the
oil industry probably saved a whale or 2.
Absolutely. I mean, it was the first oil crisis was the whale oil crisis. We were running out of whales, we were running out of light, and people were genuinely worried. And kerosene came on the market, and it actually was better and more abundant, immediately took over. Whales were kind of saved to an extent.
Who started doing this?
There were huge whaling fleets all over the world. It was a massive, massive industry. I mean, it's Moby Dick. And then in the 1890s, cars started.
Yeah.
I wonder, when was fuel oil distilled from?
People started using oil in ships around the turn of the century.
And it was Churchill who made the big decision for the Royal Navy to move from coal to...
Yeah, because of the logistic problems, because the coal wasn't at the places where they needed. If you take a typical coaling station for the British Royal Navy in the 1880s, would have been somewhere like Aden. You've got a situation where you had to stockpile an enormous amount of coal and you had to move it all there, which was really difficult and dirty and like costly, and store it in conditions which weren't ideal. Whereas when you looked at the transformation of oil, it was easier to move around.
Well, the big thing was you didn't need the people. One of the big things, you didn't need the people on the ship. So with the coal, you had coal in the back of the ship and the engines in the front, and you have to have people moving it.
Yeah.
Whereas when you had oil, you could pump it. But then you needed
Two things
oil.
happened at once. You got the development of the turbine, and then you got the development of oil firing at the same time, and those 2 things made the transformation. So you then ended up with like the Dreadnought class from the 1900s onwards, which was a whole new method of battleships where naval warfare basically went from broadside to turret. So instead of lining your ship up alongside the other person, you actually had a gun that moved around rather than moving the ship around, which changed naval warfare completely.
But then you needed a complete different approach to energy, because obviously we had our
Yes.
own coal. You had to move it around, but the coal came from the UK.
Yes.
We didn't have any oil. So, okay, you've got to go invade some
Yes.
places like Iran and create the Anglo-Persian Oil Company.
Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which then became the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which then became BP,
Yeah.
which was owned by the British government. It was the national oil company to supply oil to the Navy, basically, is what it was about.
Yeah. But it's amazing how we just don't think about how fragile this is, because we are less than 200 years into an industrial revolution, and the amount of energy we use per person is off the charts.
Yes.
But it's dependent on every single day deliveries of fossil fuels from unstable regions around the world. And we can't stop for a single day.
Yeah.
And nobody thinks about it.
What would happen if we did stop?
Everything would stop. That's the thing. Everything would stop.
We have a society that is supported entirely by an energy consumption way above what we could have expected 200 years ago. It's so interwoven. You cannot just stop oil. You have to replace it with something.
Well, that's the wonderful thing about renewable energy. And there's a great statistic this week about the difference between the energy generating potential of a ship of fossil fuels versus a ship of solar panels. And it's about 500 times, on pretty conservative assumptions, it could be up to thousands of times, more energy you get from a ship full of solar panels. Because they come, they sit, and they generate energy for 25 years. Sure, you don't get it all up front immediately, but they continue. And if you have an interruption in your flow of solar panels, well, you survive on your current solar panels. If you have an interruption in the flow of oil, you're done.